Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 466. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, joined today by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today. We got a lot to talk about. Want to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to share the show. Hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. Follow the show at con_interest on Twitter. And with that, Connor, I'm going to just start getting into the news today. I got a couple stories before I hand it over to you. First up here from Dave DeCamp, August 30th, antiwar.com. Russia says Ukrainian drone attacks not possible without help from the West. And of course, Connor, this is something that we already knew and have been saying on the show. And, Russia is, I think, just acknowledging this reality once again. The spokesperson for Russia stressed that Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles would not have been able to travel such a distance without information from feeds from Western satellites. And, this does seem to be correct to me, Connor. And, it is a major escalation in this war. And Russia acknowledging this and pointing this out likely means from the Russian perspective that, they're ready to escalate against these Western provocations, and they have been carrying out some pretty major attacks on Kiev in recent days. All right, let's move on here. Senator Blumenthal, U.S. getting its money's worth in Ukraine because Americans aren't dying. So just before this show, me and Connor were having a conversation about just what the death toll in Ukraine may be. And, kind of as we've been saying on this show, it's really hard to say because nobody is being honest. It is certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Where that number is, it's hard to say, and that would be combined. My guess is that it's well over 100,000 for Ukraine. I'm not quite sure it's that high for Russia. And that also, depends, too, who you're counting. For the Ukrainian forces, are you counting the Foreign Legion forces fighting on behalf of Ukraine, the various militias? Are you, when it comes to Russia, counting the Donbass and Luhansk fighters, the Donetsk and Luhansk fighters, as separate from Russian? Are you counting the Wagner group as separate from Russia? And so these are all, important questions you gotta factor in when you're trying to do the death counts. But, hundreds of thousands of, young men mostly have been just killed. Their lives absolutely over in the prime of their lives on the battlefield here. So this is what he wrote in the Connecticut Post. Even Americans who have no particular interest in freedom and independence and democracies worldwide should be satisfied that we are getting our money's worth on our Ukrainian investment. For less than 3% of our nation's military budget, we have enabled Ukraine to degrade Russia's military strength by half, all without a single American serviceman or woman injured or lost, he added. And I mean, this is just unbelievably disgusting, Connor. And not surprising that this particular senator said it, because he has long been a piece of garbage in the U.S. government. But it is just, one more instance, and I think it's very important that we highlight it every time it happens, where American officials are coming right out and saying that, the Ukrainian lives mean absolutely nothing. We have no problem with them dying as long as they are killing Russians and taking some Russians to the grave with them. All right, next up here, Ukraine blasts Pope Francis for address to Russian youth. Ukrainian officials have sharply criticized Pope Francis for an address he gave to young Russian Catholics, accusing him of spreading imperialist propaganda for saying Russians should be proud of their heritage. This is what the Pope said. Never forget your heritage. You are descendants of great Russia, the great Russia of saints, rulers, the great Russia of Peter I, Catherine II. That empire educated great culture and great humanity. Never give up on that heritage. And so, I mean, this is just crazy that the Ukrainians would come out and start attacking the Pope for basically saying that, Russia is a place with, history and culture, but that is what the Ukrainians are upset about. And if you look at what's been happening inside of Russia since the Russian invasion, well, even before, really since 2014, there's been a real systematic campaign within the Ukrainian government to try to eliminate any Russian cultural influence in Ukraine, and that has only intensified over the past 18 months. All right, next up here, a little bit of news about the situation in China. U.S. OK's first ever foreign military aid financing arms package for Taiwan. The Biden administration has approved the first ever military aid package for Taiwan using foreign military financing. That's the FMF, and that's a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S. arms. And so, Connor, it's really interesting. You have this country, Taiwan, that in the U.S. ideal is celebrated as this, like strong Western presence right off the coast of China, and yet for some reason we still have to finance their military. All these supposed successful countries can never defend themselves, and always interesting why that's the case. And then this next article here, I do think is really important. And Dave DeCamp, the author of this article, and our colleague at antiwar.com, pointed this one out on Twitter. So the article here, British Parliament calls Taiwan an independent country as foreign minister visits China. And Dave writes, an influential group of British members of Parliament referred to Taiwan as an independent country in a report issued on Wednesday as the British Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is visiting China. And as Dave pointed out on Twitter, Connor, I do think this is something that eventually, if not very soon, American politicians are going to pick up on and start doing. It's going to be seen as extremely provocative by China, by Beijing, as a violation and, a complete walk-back from the one China policy, this idea that has existed, for a very long time, that Taiwan and mainland China are a part of the same political entity. And look, that is, I think, still the majority opinion in Taiwan, is not to declare independence. And yet you had these Western countries essentially declaring independence for Taiwan, which is going to maybe provoke a Chinese military invasion. At least a blockade of the island is not going to be good for the Taiwanese people. All right, Connor, I got a few articles here that I wrote this week on the Middle East. First up, General Milley says U.S. forces will remain in the Middle East for years to come. This is America's top general. He said that Washington plans to maintain its force posture in the Middle East. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, stressed that the region's significant importance to American foreign policy. In an interview with Jordanian media on Thursday, this would have been 1 week ago, Milley said, I can't imagine that the United States would ever walk away from the Middle East. I think we will remain committed for many, many years and decades to come. And unsurprised by this, Connor, even as our Middle East policy is just one calamity after another, let's get into what's happening in Syria. This is in eastern Syria. I have two stories here on Syria, actually. The first in eastern Syria, where dozens are killed by fighting among Washington's Syrian allies. Wrote this for the Institute on the 30th. Over 30 people were killed in battles between the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's the SDF, and the Deir al-Zor Military Council, that's the DEMC. Both the SDF and the DEMC are supported by the U.S. And just for understanding, the SDF is the primarily group that primarily controls U.S.-occupied Syria in eastern Syria, and that is a Kurdish-led group, where the DEMC is a smaller Arab group that exists just in the region around Deir al-Zor. So fighting erupted between the two groups when the SDF captured the leader of the DEMC, that's Abu Kawala, and he was arrested during a meeting on Sunday. It seems like something of a maybe underhanded move, Connor, where there was supposed to be a meeting between these two groups, and the leader of the DEMC was just arrested. And so after the arrest, in total 32 people, including at least 3 civilians, were killed amid the clashes, although I read today that number had increased to 34. I'm not sure if that's because the fighting has maybe reignited, or if it's because more wounded people had to come to their injuries. However, as of yesterday, sources were reporting that fighting between the SDF and DEMC has ceased as the DEMC's leader agreed to step down. The SDF alleged that he was engaged in committing multiple crimes, including drug trafficking and this was a quote from them, coordinating with external entities hostile to the revolution. And that statement suggests that the SDF was unhappy with his outreach to the Syrian government. The SDF and DEMC are just two of a multitude of militants that the U.S. bats in Syria. The White House primarily relies on the SDF to govern the eastern region of Syria that 900 American soldiers occupy. Washington initially seized the territory in Syria amidst the campaign against the Islamic State. However, ISIS has largely been eradicated in Syria by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, along with his Shia, Iranian, and Russian allies. Washington since admitted that it keeps its forces in Syria to steal resources and to diminish Iranian influence in the Middle East. The policy of occupying eastern Syria has prolonged the war in the Middle Eastern nation, intensifying the suffering of the Syrian people. All right, so now let's look to northern Syria before I hand this over to Connor. Congressmen visit rebel-controlled Syria, meet with al-Qaeda-linked group. So 3 congressmen traveled to the region of Syria controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that's HTS, and that's an offshoot of al-Qaeda. The congressional delegation met with several Syrians who were suffering and blamed President Bashar al-Assad for the poor living conditions. Republican Congressman Ben Cline, Scott Fitzgerald, and French Hill spent about 30 minutes inside rebel-held Syrian territory on Sunday morning, according to the Washington Post. The State Department limited the travel of the representatives over security concerns. So they wanted to travel further into Syria and spend more time in the country. The State Department seems to have limited the visit to one hospital and just the border crossing. So I believe at all times the congressmen were within like eyesight of of Turkey, of being able to cross back into Turkey from Syria. The short visit to Syria included stops at the Bab al-Salama border post and the hospital in the Aleppo district. The region is controlled by HTS, which the Office of the Director of National Intelligence says evolved from Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda's former branch in Syria. HTS hopes to overthrow Assad to establish a government guided by a fundamentalist interpretation of Islamic law. Additionally, the DNI admits the group uses common terror tactics such as suicide bombings. Still, Congressman Hill voices support for HTS's desire to overthrow Assad. He said the Assad regime's production and distribution of illegal drugs is threatening regional societies and financially fueling Assad's reign of terror, which must be stopped. The Syrian people have endured much more than a decade of war, murder, and torture. It is imperative that the nations across the globe, including the United States, work together to provide humanitarian aid to the Syrian people and to counter Assad's regime. However, Washington's decade-long policy of attempting to overthrow Assad's government has led to the intense suffering of the Syrian people. During the Obama administration, the CIA armed and funded rebel groups opposing Assad. The program fueled the insurgency and led to the rise of the Islamic State and other jihad groups in Syria, such as HTS and Nusra. Syria has been heavily targeted by American sanctions. The economic warfare against Damascus has caused widespread suffering of the Syrian people. Earlier this year, after a massive earthquake struck Syria, the White House refused to lift sanctions on Damascus, preventing crucial aid from reaching the victims. Congressman Hill went on to call on other countries in the Middle East to refuse to normalize their relationship with Damascus, as doing so would boost Syria's economic ties in the region and the living standards of the Syrian people. While the congressman met with members of the White Helmets, while in Syria, the congressman also met with members of the White Helmets. Through the Syrian war, the group has operated as a public relations management firm for the jihadist groups like al-Nusra. And so essentially what they would do is they would stage atrocities committed by the Syrian government and then film them and claim that, and put that out as propaganda. Now, I'm sure the White Helmets actually did some actual good work and did rescue a few people from under rubble, But at the same time, they also, again, engaged in a lot of propaganda efforts on behalf of the jihadist groups that were in that territory. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Connor. I think he's got a few articles for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is continuing on Syria. Israel bombed Damascus earlier. Excuse me, not Damascus. That's been happening quite a bit lately. It's actually the International Aleppo Airport, once again rendering it inoperable. This is from Dave DeCamp on August 28th at antiwar.com. So Israeli airstrikes put Syria's Aleppo airport out of service. So Israeli airstrikes on Syria targeted the Aleppo airport. This was early Monday morning. They knocked it out of service, according to Syria Sana news agency, which reported that at about 4:30 a.m. on Monday, the Israeli enemy carried out an aerial act of aggression from the direction of the Mediterranean Sea west of Latakia, targeting the Aleppo airport. And this is from a military source. So no casualties were reported in the attack, but the source said that it caused material damage to the airport runway, putting it out of service. And this marks the fifth time since September of last year that Israeli airstrikes have shut down the Aleppo airport, and the fourth time this year. Of course, Aleppo was devastated by the earthquake earlier this year that you previously mentioned, Kyle, which hit Turkey and Syria back in February. And the city's airport had become a vital channel for aid, including courtesy of the Saudis. But that has not stopped the Israeli attacks. We've seen Israeli airstrikes put the Aleppo airport out of commission twice in March and again in May. So Monday's airstrikes marked at least the 23rd time this year that Israel has bombed Syria. And the last known strike hit targets near Damascus on August 21st, which wounded at least one Syrian soldier. And of course, earlier this year, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had doubled the airstrikes in Syria since they came to power at the end of December of 2022. And Israel frames its airstrikes in Syria. These are always operations, of course, against Iran and Hezbollah, but they're very often killing Syrian civilians, Syrian soldiers, and targeting civilian infrastructure. Okay, so yeah, it's just awful to see this. And I don't know if that's actually, I think that what's disturbing especially is that the Israelis have been bombing Syria for every week for years, and we've been covering it week in, week out on the show. And so for Netanyahu and his defense minister to boast that they're doubling the strikes, even if that's not true, the fact that they're saying it, it reflects, again, just how hawkish and toxic that whole society is, and why we should not be involved, fighting Israel's wars for them or supporting these strikes. And we know from the Wall Street Journal last year that a large percentage of the airstrikes that are carried out in Syria by the Israelis are coordinated with Central Command and with the Pentagon. So, of course, so much of this is absolutely 100% America's responsibility. Okay, but moving on to Iran. We have some stories here about Iran had summoned a Swiss diplomat because Switzerland often acts as a mediator between the two sides over this oil that was recently stolen off of that tanker that was taken to Texas that was originally headed for China that contained Iranian oil. So this is from Dave again on August 28th at antiwar.com. Iran summoned Swiss diplomat over Iranian oil stolen by the U.S. So on Monday, Nasser Kanani, the Iranian foreign ministry spokesman, said that Tehran had summoned a Swiss diplomat over the discharging of a tanker carrying Iranian oil that was seized by the United States. So Kanani said Iran summoned the charge d'affaires at the Swiss embassy to express strong objection to the move to Switzerland. And the subject of the seizure of an Iranian oil consignment by the U.S. is a completely unproductive action, Kanani said. He noted the U.S. was expressing interest in a renewed nuclear deal while also increasing sanctions and seizing Iranian oil shipments. And the tanker Suez Rajan was estimated to be carrying 800,000 barrels of Iranian oil and was forced by the U.S. to sail to Texas instead of China under the pretext of sanctions enforcement. And the Suez Rajan transferred the cargo to another tanker, the MR Euphrates, which is currently moored in Houston. The Suez Rajan was stuck off the coast of Galveston for months as American companies were hesitant to unload the cargo due to fears of Iranian reprisals. The U.S. seizure of the Suez Rajan in April provoked the Iranian seizure of two tankers in the Persian Gulf. So the U.S. responded to those seizures by increasing their military presence in the region, just raising tensions, of course, and including sending 3,000 Marines and Navy sailors as part of an amphibious readiness group and Marine Expeditionary Unit. And the U.S. is also considering putting armed troops on commercial vessels. What's concerning is, of course, there was, as Dave notes here, there was such reluctance for anybody to unload that oil because it would just be we'd be basically putting a target on your back if you want to sail your tankers through the Persian Gulf. So somebody is confident that they have some kind of protection here, and I hope it's not because they've been promised or assured that the U.S. will be putting armed troops on their vessels in the future. This whole policy is so schizophrenic because, of course, Kanani's correct that there was a tentative deal that was being worked out with Robert Malley, the former special envoy for Iran and Iran's UN ambassador. The negotiations were being carried out on American soil. There was recently a deal made where some prisoners are being released, Iranian American prisoners that have been held in Iran are being released in exchange for some assets being unfrozen that were held in South Korea. They're going to an account in Qatar where the Iranians will be able to access them and only be able to use them on humanitarian goods that are ostensibly exempt from sanctions like food and medicine, which, of course, the sanctions have been depriving Iranians of for years and years. But at the same time, we have this buildup, this military buildup, preparing for a future confrontation with Iran that could happen sooner rather than later with all the different, close calls that are going on in Syria. The fact that we could see, of course, American bases coming under attack again, the more these militias are provoked, and the more we see ISIS carrying out attacks in Syria again, all of a sudden. So it just opens up a lot of different possibilities of things going wrong here. And of course, Mali was sidelined by hawks in both countries, according to that report in Middle East Eye. So we're going to have to see what comes next here. But unfortunately, the way this expansion of U.S. power, military power in the Middle East is being spun is, Milley's saying we're here indefinitely, for decades to come. But it's also being hyped as we're assuring the Saudis that we can give you a security guarantee and we will go to war on your behalf against your enemies, Iran. And the Israelis, there's reports in Axios too, they're looking for security guarantees from the Americans as well as a part of this deal with Saudi Arabia. And of course, Iran is being used as the boogeyman to justify all of this. But we'll have to see what happens next here. But so this next piece is about Iran in Iraq, demanding that Baghdad agree to disarm Kurdish militant groups, Kurdish armed terrorist groups in the northern autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq. So Iran has announced that they reached an agreement with Iraq to both disarm and relocate exiled Iranian Kurdish armed terrorist groups operating in camps in the autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq on Monday. Baghdad must accomplish this task before a mid-September deadline unless Iranian forces will intervene. And so speaking before a news conference, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani said that according to a deal reached between the Iranian and Iraqi governments, the Iraqi government has pledged to disarm armed terrorist groups in Iraq by September 19th. And Tehran has also notified the UN of its demands and of the agreement with Iraq. So Iran's foreign ministry put out a statement that says that the relations between Iran and Iraq are warm, friendly, and constructive, but the presence of terrorist and separatist armed forces in the Kurdistan region with armed activities against Iran's security is a black point in bilateral relations. And as an Iraqi foreign ministry spokesman had said, this demand was outlined in the agreement that was signed regarding border security that was signed by both governments earlier this year. Kanani clarified that there will be no extensions on that deadline. He said the September 19th deadline will under no circumstances be extended. After this deadline, if Iraq fails to meet its commitments, the Iranian government will assume its responsibility in order to ensure the country's security. So Tehran has accused these Kurdish groups of being involved with some of Tel Aviv's attacks as well as recent civil unrest within Iran's borders. In March of 2022, as a response to Israeli drone attacks in Tabriz, which killed as many as 3 people, Iran's Revolutionary Guard launched a ballistic missile strike on Erbil, the Iraqi Kurdistan region's capital, targeting an alleged Mossad base. And then later in November, the Revolutionary Guard was carrying out drone and missile strikes, and I believe some artillery strikes as well on the Iraqi Kurdistan, targeting these opposition groups like Komala and the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, killing some fighters. And this came as Tehran was cracking down on the domestic protests, particularly in the Kurdish regions, during these major demonstrations sparked by the death of Masha Amini, a young Iranian Kurdish woman. Amini died while in police custody. Other Kurdish militant groups based in Iraq, such as the Kurdistan Freedom Party, have been attacking Iran during the protests as well. And I think for political reasons, it benefits the government in Tehran to look like they're doing something about this, even if it's, even if they're exaggerating the involvement of these Kurdish groups. It just looks like they're cracking down and trying to, establish some order. So unfortunately, it just could mean more conflict. But there's an interesting note here from the AP I'll get to in a moment that sounds like things are moving along and like there hasn't been much of an issue yet. So let's see. So this came as okay. So per the new agreement, Baghdad is committed to transfer these Kurdish militants to camps provided by the Iraqi government, and that could be. It's not really been explained yet where those camps will be located or if they've already been built. But transit camps in Iraq where Sunni Muslim refugees, including family members of Islamic State members and other displaced people, are held, including those who were moved from Syria to Iraq, have a notorious reputation. So according to aid workers, there's widespread sexual abuse, for instance, in these camps that's being perpetrated by staff from the UN as well as Iraqi security forces. The Associated Press then cited an unnamed Iraqi official as confirming the agreement, and the official told the news agency that the rebels have been moved to an unspecified camp within the Iraqi Kurdish region after having been disarmed. So we'll stay on top of that story and see if anything develops further. I know there have been some statements from Tehran that basically say that the Iraqis are following suit and meeting their obligations. But beyond that, I haven't seen any further updates on this particular story. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I know there's been quite a bit of tensions here over between the Iranians and the Kurds, and of course the Turks and the Kurds. And there were strikes in Iraqi Kurdistan from both Iran and Turkey last year. And the Iranians are accusing the Kurds based in Iraq of supporting the separatist movement in Western Iran. And so hopefully this doesn't get that much worse, but yeah, it sounds like they've been moved to these camps according to the AP. So we'll follow up on that soon. Okay, this next story is from Middle East Eye. Saudi Arabia mulls nuclear power offers from China and Russia in a bid to sway the U.S. So once again, we're back to this deal about normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And a huge part of this is, as I said earlier, using Iran as a boogeyman. Saudi Arabia wants a security guarantee. They want access to even more advanced American weapons, as well as assistance building their own nuclear program. And in exchange for this, the U.S. is demanding that they normalize with Israel and pour some money into institutions in the West Bank. I don't know why that's Saudi Arabia's obligation in the deal, but that's what the Americans are asking for. And so it's pretty interesting here to see Saudi turning to China instead, because currently Saudi Arabia has all the leverage in this in these negotiations, and the Americans are really just looking out for Israel's interests, at least on the surface. I mean, they've already normalized relations with Iran, so it's not, it doesn't stand to reason that Saudi Arabia is still that threatened, where they would want to get a security guarantee from the Americans in order to, go if they go to war with Iran. That seems like more of a priority of the Israelis. But so this story says Saudi Arabia is considering bids to build a nuclear power station from countries including China, Russia, and France, as the kingdom attempts to pressure the U.S. over a sensitive security pact. This is according to a report in the Financial Times. So Saudi Arabia has long sought their own civil nuclear capability, and they've made U.S. assistance with the program a key demand and a potential deal to normalize with Tel Aviv. A breakthrough in relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, would be a major diplomatic victory for Biden's administration, which has described it as a priority. I think they need some sort of diplomatic win, and that's one of the things that Tom Freeman and some of these other big Zionists in the media are promoting, that this would be great for the White House. And of course, they want to curtail China's influence, but this is going the other way. So, but Washington is balked at Saudi Arabia's demand for there to be no restrictions on enriching its own uranium. While the U.S. is insisting on placing restrictions on the use of the technology, Saudi is considering alternative offers to develop the nuclear facilities from countries including China, Russia, and France, according to a person familiar with the matter. So, according to the report in Financial Times, the person said Saudi Arabia would make its decision based on the best offer. Meanwhile, another person familiar with the matter said that while Riyadh would prefer the U.S., which is considered to have better technology and is already a close Saudi ally, Washington's restrictions on uranium enrichment would rule out cooperation. So in recent years, Riyadh is drawing closer to China, its largest trading partner, and earlier this week, the Gulf Kingdom was invited to join the BRICS group of emerging economies, along with Iran. And so last year, Riyadh hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping for a regional summit, with Beijing this March brokering rapprochement between the kingdom and its main rival in the region, Iran. So, but the kingdom remains heavily reliant on U.S. security support and wants Washington to agree to a mutual defense pact in exchange for normalizing relations with Israel. So earlier this month, Israel said it would not necessarily oppose an agreement that would allow Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium for research purposes, according to Shaki Hanegbi, the Israeli National Security Advisor. Hanegbi told public broadcaster Khan that Israel's consent was not needed for such a move. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates operate nuclear research centers, and these are not dangerous, he said. Dozens of countries operate projects with civilian nuclear cores, with nuclear endeavors for energy. This is not something that endangers them or their neighbors. Though the security advisor's comments focused on a civilian nuclear program, Riyadh had previously talked up its desire to develop a nuclear bomb. In March 2018, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said Saudi Arabia does not want to acquire any nuclear bomb, but without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible. Since then, Riyadh and Tehran have reestablished diplomatic relations. And of course, I mean, this is one of the issues, right? I mean, by Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, we've seen Iran significantly expand its nuclear program. They're not going to go beyond 60% enriched uranium. And in fact, there's reports coming out in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere showing that they may even be blending down their current stockpile to lower levels of enrichment. And they really, they committed in 2021 that they would not expand beyond 60%, and they haven't. And they've had ample reasons to do so in the meantime. What's interesting is there's a piece by Paul Pillar at Responsible Statecraft right now about how the FDD, Mark Dubowitz, the most powerful anti-Iran, pro-Israel think tank in the Beltway, they're actually making the case that it would be better for Israel if Iran would enrich to 90% or more their uranium, because if they stop enriching where they are now, it opens up the possibility where there's discussions of, say, like a freeze for freeze kind of deal, which I don't think the Iranians are too keen on. But this idea of, okay, we will not expand sanctions if you don't expand your uranium enrichment anymore, and so it'll be like a draw. I think that's a bad deal for Iran, but even something like that terrifies the Israel lobby and the Iran hawks, because they have to maintain this constant tension, this constant threat of war and demonization of Iran to keep them isolated and divert all this attention from what Israel's crimes are in the West Bank and Gaza, and bombing Syria every week, and even bombing Lebanon earlier this year, and their attacks on Iran as well, and how all the risk of war just in our partnership, or whatever you want to call it, our special relationship with the Israelis, and they have to distract from that to make it look like Iran is the most destabilizing force in the region. It's just not true. They're not good. They're not angels, but it's certainly not the most destabilizing force. You might want to look at Israel or the United States for that. But so, okay, so this next piece is about the coup in Chile. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on the 29th. So this is called Released Documents Show Nixon's Intel Briefings Related to U.S.-Backed Chilean Coup from 1973. So two 50-year-old documents related to the coup in Chile released by the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department last week. The democratically elected left-wing government of President Salvador Allende was overthrown in 1973 by the Chilean military with covert CIA backing. A U.S.-supported dictatorship then led by General Augusto Pinochet was subsequently installed. And President Richard Nixon's daily briefs related to the coup on September 8th, as well as the 11th, the day the Chilean military seized control of the government, were released. So the declassification followed repeated calls for increased transparency by progressive members of Congress, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, actually, but also years of demands from human rights groups and the government in Santiago. And so Nixon and his then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger strongly opposed the leftist Allende government and attempted to prevent its rule. George Washington University's National Security Archive issued a statement on the documents, which said that these documents contain information that went to President Nixon as a military takeover that he and Kissinger had encouraged for 3 years came to fruition, as it came to fruition. So Nixon's daily brief for September 8th, 1973 reads, "A number of reports have been received indicating the possibility of an early military coup. Navy men plotting to overthrow the government now claim Army and Air Force support." The document, written 3 days before the coup, continues with the discussion of how a fascist paramilitary group, quote, has been blocking roads and provoking clashes with the national police, adding the tension caused by continuing strikes and opposition political moves. President Allende earlier this week said he believed that armed forces will ask for his resignation if he does not change his economic. And so then 3 days later on the 11th, Nixon's daily brief says plans by Navy officers to trigger military action against the Allende government are supported by some key Army units. The Navy is also counting on help from the Air Force and National Police. So after Allende's initial refusal to resign, tanks opened fire. Air Force aircraft launched rocket attacks and bombed the presidential palace. Troops stormed in, and Allende shot himself with an AK-47. And what followed the coup, this is from Common Dreams' Jake Johnson. He wrote, "What followed the coup was a vicious decades-long reign of terror and repression during which tens of thousands of Chileans were killed, tortured, or disappeared by the Pinochet regime, which continued to receive support from the CIA. Indeed, in 2000, the CIA conceded in a report that, quote, many of Pinochet's officers were involved in systematic and widespread human rights abuses. Some of these were contacts or agents of the CIA and the U.S. military." So Peter Kornbluh, Chile specialist for the National Security Archive, said, "I'm happy the Freedom of Information Act, together with some positive diplomacy by the Chilean government, broke a secrecy barrier that has kept us from knowing this history for 50 years. He added that he hopes the White House will soon be releasing all the U.S. records on Chile relating to the coup and its aftermath that inexplicably remains secret after all this time." Of course, the U.S. government favored Pinochet, who for most of his 17 years of rule had good economic and military ties with Washington, as he repressed many of his own people, as the LA Times noted this week. And throughout Latin America during the Cold War, the CIA was involved in overthrowing governments while fueling a series of proxy wars and civil wars, as well as waging terror campaigns against others like Cuba. To this day, the U.S. maintains a more than 60-year-old embargo on Cuba, as well as a notorious torture prison at Guantanamo Bay. During recent years, the U.S. has supported coups against governments in Venezuela and Bolivia. The U.S. currently imposes sanctions on Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. In Venezuela, Washington's economic war led to tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths between 2017 and 2018 as a result of vital medicines being deprived. And additionally, among current GOP presidential candidates, there is substantial support for a potential military invasion and drone war in Mexico to ostensibly counter the cartels and drug trafficking. So even though the Cold War is over, we still have a pretty horrible, hostile, and brutal policy with respect to Latin America. And it's one of the reasons why, for instance, AMLO, the leader of Mexico, does not favor these policies of the Biden administration and their attempts to isolate countries in the region like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, that they see the potential for a united Latin America as being much more important than just following the U.S. dictates. Okay, so this next piece is on this latest missile test by Kim Jong-un as the U.S., I guess they're wrapping up the All-She Freedom Shield exercises today. These are massive military exercises we talked about last week. Tens of thousands of troops from both the U.S. and South Korea. And the South Korean Defense Ministry said it was being carried out on the largest scale ever. And there's other countries are involved too, like Britain and France and Canada. But so Pyongyang test fires 2 ballistic missiles as U.S. flies bombers, conducts war games. And this is from August 30th. So hours after the U.S. flew bombers in separate joint air drills with Tokyo and Seoul, North Korea test-fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles. And this comes as Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, has warned that increased military provocations by the U.S., Japan, and South Korea could cause a nuclear war. Ancillary to Washington's massive All-She Freedom Shield annual joint war games with Seoul, a U.S. B-1B flew alongside South Korean F-A-50 jets and American F-16s on Wednesday. And this marks Washington's 10th such bomber flight this year. The 11-day exercise involves tens of thousands of troops from both countries and, as I said, runs until today, August 31st, when we're recording the show. Pyongyang has denounced the drills as war rehearsals and responded by conducting a missile launch last week, which Kim personally oversaw. Tokyo participated on Monday in a trilateral naval missile defense drill with the U.S. and South Korea. Actually, my mistake. That was on Tuesday. But in another exercise on Wednesday, 2 U.S. B-1B bombers joined 12 Japanese fighter jets, including 4 F-15s. So South Korea's military announced Pyongyang hours later had launched 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the sea. Japanese media concurrently reported that 2 missiles landed outside of Tokyo's exclusive economic zone. North Korean state media described the missile launches as a warning against Washington's strategic bomber deployments. Since 2022, these gargantuan joint U.S.-South Korean live-fire war games have resumed, and in response, the DPRK has launched more than 100 missiles. So the KCNA news agency report added out of North Korea that the missile unit fired 2 tactical ballistic missiles northeastward at Pyongyang International Airport and correctly carried out its nuclear strike mission. The test fires simulated strikes on South Korea's command posts and airfields. In a statement, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said our military has strengthened surveillance and vigilance in preparation for additional provocations. We're maintaining full readiness through close cooperation between South Korea and the United States. And so under the Joe Biden administration, tensions have been soaring on the Korean Peninsula, largely as a result of these myriad war games, which have seen the White House deploy not only nuclear-capable bombers, again, repeatedly, but aircraft carrier strike groups and armed Reaper drones. So last month, a U.S. nuclear-armed submarine docked in South Korea for the first time since 1981. And so Kim said during his speech on Tuesday, owing to the reckless confrontational moves of the U.S. and other hostile forces, the waters off the Korean Peninsula have been reduced into the world's biggest war hardware concentration spot, the most unstable waters with the danger of a nuclear war. And last week, Biden, along with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, met with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at Camp David, and the White House declared that the 3 sides had agreed to, quote, a multi-year trilateral exercise plan, entailing a multi-year trilateral framework that includes annual named multi-domain trilateral exercises, which will constitute an unprecedented level of trilateral defense cooperation. The burgeoning alliance is ancillary to Washington's buildup in the Asia-Pacific for a coming war with China. And so U.S. Space Force officials also said on Wednesday that the U.S. and South Korean militaries will now be closely integrating their systems for tracking Pyongyang's missile launches, eyeing deeper cooperation in the near term with Japan as well. And so the U.S. intelligence community, it's always important to note, earlier this year it was revealed that they assess that Kim will not use his nuclear weapons for offensive military purposes. He intends to use them solely as a means for achieving political and diplomatic ends, like seeing sanctions lifted or seeing the war games scaled back. Expanded war drills will surely inflame tensions with Pyongyang, and from the sounds of it, they're going to drastically expand the drills. And so, however, Washington's in spite of the intelligence community's assessment, Washington's crippling sanctions remain imposed indefinitely as U.S. officials periodically threaten the country with obliteration. And the White House demands North Korea's complete disarmament and denuclearization as it taunts it's very, the life of their whole nation with nuclear weapons. So that's where we're at, just raising tensions and basically using North Korea, hanging that over the heads of our in the Pacific so that we can build up further for war with China.
All right, Connor.
Great strategy. All right.
Thank you so much for the update, and we'll be back with more shows next week.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.